Chapter 6, Non-Experimental Research. So in this chapter, we will discuss two non-experimental research methods, the correlational method and the observational method. We also discuss when and why non-experimental research methods are appropriate to use. The first section, 28, Overview of Non-Experimental Research. All right, so what is non-experimental research? There are no manipulations in independent variables in non-experimental research studies. Rather, variables are measured that naturally occur in the natural world or in the lab settings. However, this does not make this type of method less important than experimental research studies because some variables simply cannot be manipulated for practical or ethical reasons. So, when to use non-experimental research? As previously discussed, experimental research is employed when investigating cause and effect relationships, especially when it is practical and ethical to manipulate independent variables, right? However, not all research questions involve causality. Non-experimental methods are appropriate for examining correlations between variables, such as the relationship between language and intelligence, or situations where random assignment is not feasible or ethical, such as studying the impact of hippocampus removal on long-term memory. Choosing between non-experimental and experimental methods depends on the research question. We know that the goals of science are to describe, predict, and explain. Non-experimental methods are suitable for description or prediction or both. For example, Milgram's obedience study was non-experimental because he focused primarily on one variable, that is, whether or not participants obeyed instructions to shock a Confederate. In his study, all participants performed the same task under identical conditions. But later, to investigate the explanation of his participants' behaviors, Milgram conducted experiments to test factors influencing obedience by manipulating various independent variables, including the distance between the experimenter and the participant, the distance between the participant and Confederate, and the study's location. There are two broad categories under non-experimental research methods. One is correlational and the other is observational. Correlational research methods involve at least two measured variables in which one level of a variable is likely to be associated with a particular level of another variable. It's important to note that these variables are not manipulated by researchers. For example, researchers may be interested in investigating whether students who sit in the front uh, row, ROW, tend to score better on exams. In this example, one variable is where a student sits in the lecture room. Another variable is their college grades. Another example is to investigate if children who eat more green vegetables have more energy. In an observational research method, on the other hand, researchers observe specific targeted behaviors, which are quantified and recorded in some cases. For example, Milgram's obedience study was a type of observational research study. These example methods are quantitative in nature, meaning that targeted behaviors are quantified and converted into numbers. In contrast, qualitative research methods produce data that are based on non-numerical information. Therefore, statistical analysis cannot be used. For example, in Rosenhan's observational study, several individuals, including psychiatrists, graduate students, and Rosenhan himself, visited psychiatric hospitals at various locations and pretended they heard voices in their head to see if they would be admitted as patients. All of those pseudo patients were admitted, but some of them had difficulties being released even after revealing they were researchers. Rosenhan's analysis primarily provides a written account for the pseudo patient's experiences. In a cross-sectional study, two or more pre-existing groups of people are compared, such as the group of people who were born prior to or after the 1960s. This type of method is non-experimental because no random assignments are involved, since kind of obvious, but you cannot randomly assign a certain group of people to be born in a certain year. One of the advantages of the cross-sectional method is that the data can be quickly collected from different age groups. Limitations include the cohort effect or the effect of different generations. For example, many people who were old enough to remember before the development of the measles vaccine in the 1960s experienced deaths of family members and friends from measles. In contrast, those who were born after the use of the measles vaccine became the norm probably have never personally heard of death due to this infection. This difference may influence how these two groups perceive the importance of vaccines. Next, the longitudinal study method. In this particular method, one group of participants is measured over time. This method not only eliminates the cohort effect, but also offers the means of the effect of age. However, the longitudinal study method can be time-consuming and may require extensive funding and investment on the part of the researchers and the participants. A third approach, known as a cross-sequential studies, merges features of both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. Like the longitudinal method, data can be collected over an extended period, such as a 10-year span. However, unlike the longitudinal study, data can be gathered from different age groups, such as 20s and 30s and 40 years old, allowing researchers to compare various age groups immediately, similar to the cross-sectional method. The advantage of this approach is that researchers can determine if the difference between groups are due to age effects or cohort effects. As discussed before, internal validity refers to how well a study's design supports the conclusion that changes in the independent variable are responsible for observed differences in the dependent variable. The figure in this slide, I actually redone this figure so you can see it better, because the figure in the textbook is kind of blurred. So this figure illustrates the strength of internal validity among experimental, quasi-experimental, some people say quasi or quasi-experimental, and correlational research. Experimental studies typically yield the highest internal validity because the manipulation of the independent variable and control of extraneous variables helps exclude alternative explanations. When a significant difference is found on the dependent variable across conditions, it is likely due to the independent variable. Non-experimental or correlational research has the lowest internal validity because no variables are manipulated or controlled, while quasi-experimental designs fall in between, using some but not all experimental features. For example, a researcher might find fewer bullying incidents in a school that implements an anti-bullying program compared to a control school. However, without random assignment, differences between students in the two schools could still account for the results, such as selection effects. Again, yielding higher internal validity does not make a specific research method better than others. Rather, it's about research questions and other factors. All right, next section, 29, correlational research. Correlational research is a type of non-experimental study where the researcher measures two variables, either binary or continuous, and examines the statistical relationship between them without controlling for other variables. Researchers should use the correlational research method if they do not believe the relationship is causal or are not interested in causality. Since science's goals are to describe and predict, correlational research allows for both. It can describe the strength and the direction of the relationship, and if a relationship exists, use scores on one variable to predict scores on the other through regression analysis, discussed further later. Another reason the researchers should use this type of method is when the relationship is thought to be causal, but manipulating the independent variable is impossible, impractical, or unethical. For example, researchers interested in the link between cannabis use frequency and memory cannot ethically manipulate cannabis consumption, so they measure usage and memory scores and analyze their relationship. Correlation also helps assess the reliability and validity of the measurements, such as validating the brief extroversion test against a validated longer version of the extroversion test. Since neither score causes the other, no independent or dependent variables are involved, and these terms do not apply here. Additionally, correlational research often has higher external validity than experiments because no variables are manipulated. Therefore, it reflects real-world conditions. While experiments increase internal validity through controls, they often reduce external validity or generalizability due to artificial settings. In contrast, correlational studies typically have lower internal validity but higher external validity, making their findings more generalizable. Lastly, correlational research can support theories by providing converging evidence. If a theory is supported by both high internal validity experiments and high external validity correlational studies, confidence in that theory increases. For example, studies linking violent TV viewing to aggression have been supported by experimental research demonstrating causality. Another example is the study of climate change. Nearly all scientists agree that human activities have affected Earth's climate, supported by extensive evidence. Hundreds of thousands of research studies worldwide consistently indicate that climate change is real. It's important to note that correlational research does not necessarily involve two quantitative variables, like scores on two memory tests or the level of stress and amount of exercise. You can have one categorical variable and one qualitative, it's a quantitative variable in a correlational study. So you can have categorical variable and one numerical or quantitative variable in a correlational study. For instance, if a researcher compares the Rosenberg self-esteem scale of 50 American and 50 Japanese college students, it is still a correlational study, not a between subjects experiment, because participants are not randomly assigned to being American or being Japanese. The graph in the slide is from a hypothetical study examining the relationship between making a daily to-do list and stress. The x-axis shows the nominal or categorical data, whether or not participants make a daily to-do list. The y-axis shows the level of stress, which is the ratio data. That's a quantitative data. That's a numerical data. Note that you cannot tell just by looking at the graph whether this is an experiment or correlational study because it depends on whether the independent variable was manipulated. If participants were randomly assigned to make or not make a to-do list, then it's an experiment. In contrast, if they were simply asked whether they make to-do lists, then it's correlational. This difference is important because if it is an experiment, we could conclude that making a to-do list reduces stress. However, if it is correlational, we can only say that these variables are statistically related. The relationship might be influenced by stress affecting planning ability, which is the directionality problem, or by a third variable that is not tested in this hypothetical study, such as maybe gender, socioeconomic status, education level, or IQ score, which may be linked to both making to-do lists and lower stress. This is called the third variable problem. In a correlational research study, participants may be asked to come to the lab to complete a test and answer questions. Researchers then analyze the relationship between these scores. Another way to collect data may be for researchers to go to a shopping mall and ask people to complete some kind of attitude questionnaire and share their shopping habits. The data will then be analyzed to see if these scores are related. An important characteristic of the correlational research method is that an independent variable is not manipulated by the researcher. Correlations between quantitative variables are often illustrated with scatter plots. So this figure, 6.3, shows hypothetical data on the relationship between stress levels and physical symptoms. Each point represents an individual's score on both variables. For instance, the circle point indicates a person with a stress score of 10 and the three points for physical symptoms. I guess that's three physical symptoms. Individuals with higher stress scores tend to have higher physical symptoms. When the stress level is lower, so is the number of physical symptoms. This pattern indicates that the data shows a positive correlation. As you can see at the bottom of the description of the figure, it's the correlation coefficient is plus positive 0.51. Look at the blue graph on your right in the slide. When the individual dots align precisely to create a straight line ascending to the right along the x-axis, it indicates a perfect positive correlation, which is the correlation coefficient of positive 1.0. When the correlation coefficient is positive 0.5, as can be seen in a purple graph, it is still positive, but the dots are a bit more scattered compared to the perfect correlation coefficient. This pattern is very similar to the previous graph showing the hypothetical data between stress level and the number of physical symptoms. When there is no correlation, as can be seen in the red graph, the correlation coefficient is 0. All dots are randomly scattered around and form no patterns. When the correlation coefficient is negative 0.5, which is orange, you start to see the pattern again, but this time it's the opposite of the positive correlation. These dots are loosely forming a pattern in which the score on the x-axis and that on the y-axis tend to go to the opposite direction. Finally, the yellow graph shows the perfect negative correlation or correlation coefficient of negative 1.0. It is important to understand that Pearson's R correlation coefficient only measures the strength of linear relationships where data points align along a straight line, but it is not effective for nonlinear relationships such as curves. For example, the relationship between sleep and depression shown in figure 6.5 forms its U shape. And so with the individuals the sleeping around 8 hours experiencing the least depression, both less and more sleep are linked to higher depression levels. So this graph shows that the optimal number of hours of sleep per night is actually better than sleeping too long or sleeping too short. Similarly, the relationship between age and physician visits also follows this U-shaped pattern. Newborns are frequently monitored by physicians, but as they grow older, visits decrease. Later, as people age further, they start to see physicians more often. Clearly, we see a strong relationship in the U-shape graph, but Pearson's R or correlation coefficient would be close to zero because the points do not form a straight line. Therefore, always check a scatter plot for linearity uh, before using Pearson's R or correlation coefficient. Nonlinear relationships are actually common in psychology, but we are not going to discuss in this course. We already know that correlation does not imply causation. An interesting example from 2012, is it 2012? I think. Study shows a strong positive correlation, which is 0.79 between countries' per capita chocolate consumption and the number of Nobel Prizes earned by its citizens. However, this does not mean that eating chocolate causes Nobel wins. Another example is the correlation between per capita consumption of margarine and the divorce rate in Maine, which you can see the graph on the slide. The graph shown in this slide indicates a very high positive correlation, which is a positive 0.993. It's almost perfect correlation, positive correlation between these two variables. However, this relationship does not mean there is causality. As discussed a few slides ago, there are two main reasons why correlation does not mean causation. One, the first one is the directionality problem. Two variables, x and y, may be statistically correlated because x causes y, or because y causes x. For example, a study might find that exercise is linked to happiness. People who exercise tend to be happier than those who do not. This relationship could indicate that exercise boosts happiness, or it could mean that feeling happy provides more energy, which encourages people to exercise. The correlational data don't give us enough information regarding the directionality of the variables. The second is the third variable problem. Two variables, x and y, can be related not because one causes the other, but because a third variable, z, influences both. For example, countries that win more Nobel Prizes often have higher chocolate consumption, likely because of geography. European countries tend to have higher per capita chocolate intake and invest more in education and technology. Similarly, the link between exercise and happiness might be driven by a third factor, such as physical health, which causes both. Correlations caused by a third variable are called spurious correlations. The correlation between per capita consumption of margarine and the divorce rate in Maine is such an example. Next section, 30, complex correlation. So far, we have discussed the relationship between two variables, but you can also compare more than two variables. We'll cover complex correlations in this section. Most complex correlational studies involve measuring multiple variables, either binary or continuous, and then analyzing the statistical relationships between them. For instance, researchers Nathan Radcliffe and William Klein examined a sample of middle-aged adults to explore how their optimism levels, assessed by a short questionnaire called the Life Orientation Test, relate to various factors associated with heart attack risk. These factors include their health status, knowledge of heart attack risk factors, and their perceptions of personal risk. Researchers found that the more optimistic individuals were, the healthier they tend to be. These healthier people were more likely to engage in exercise, had lower blood pressure, had better awareness of heart attack risks, and believed their personal risk was lower than that of their peers. Second example, another group of researchers studied adolescents' experiences with physical and psychological relationship aggression and their distress levels. They found that adolescents who face physical violence are moderately likely to also encounter psychological aggression, which is associated with symptoms of psychological distress. These complex correlational methods are frequently employed to evaluate the validity of new psychological assessments. For instance, John Cacioppo and Richard Petty developed their need for cognition scale, which measures how much individuals enjoy and value thinking. They use this scale to assess the need for cognition in a large group of college students alongside three other variables: intelligence level, socially desirable responding, which measures the tendency to give responses perceived as appropriate, and dogmatism. The results of this study are summarized in table 6.1 on the slide, which is a correlation matrix showing the correlation, which is the correlation coefficient, Pearson's R, between every possible pair of variables in the study. For example, the correlation between the need for cognition and intelligence was positive 0.39. The correlation between the need for cognition and dogmatism was negative 0.27. And the correlation between intelligence and socially desirable responding was positive 0.02, and so on. In this case, the overall pattern of correlations was consistent with the researchers' ideas about how scores on the need for cognition should be related to these other constructs. When researchers analyze relationships among many conceptually similar variables, they often use a complex statistical method called factor analysis. This technique groups the variables into fewer clusters, and the correlations between these clusters are organized based on their strength levels. Each cluster represents multiple measures of the same underlying concept, which are referred to as factors. For example, factor analysis for mental tasks can be organized into two primary factors. One linked to mathematical intelligence, such as arithmetic, quantitative estimation, and spatial reasoning, and another associated with verbal intelligence, such as grammar, reading comprehension, and vocabulary. Another example of factor analysis is the traits in the Big Five personality model. These traits were identified through factor analysis of various specific trait scores to determine correlations. In this model, warmth, activity level, and positive emotions are strongly correlated and are considered aspects of extroversion. Consider another example. Peter Renfro and Samuel Gosling surveyed over 1,700 university students, asking them to rate their preferences across 14 popular music genres. Their analysis using factor analysis revealed four distinct music preference groups: reflective and complex, and genres including blues, jazz, classical, and folk; intense and rebellious, and genres including rock, alternative, and heavy metal; upbeat and conventional, and genres including country, soundtrack, religious, and pop. And finally, energetic and rhythmic, and genres including rap, hip hop, soul, funk, and electronica. Now, it's important to understand that factors are not the same as categories. Factor analysis does not imply that individuals are strictly either extroverted or conscientious. Uh, did I say right? Conscientious, nor that they prefer only one type of music, such as reflective and complex, or intense and rebellious. Instead, factors are independent constructs, meaning that someone with a high extroversion score can have a low conscientiousness score or a high conscientiousness score. Similarly, a person who enjoys reflective, complex music might or might not enjoy intense and rebellious music. In addition, factor analysis reveals only the underlying structure of the variables. It is up to researchers to interpret and label the factors and to explain the origin of that particular factor structure. For example, one reason that extroversion and the other big five operates as separate factors is that they appear to be controlled by different genes. So we understand by now that causality can only be examined through experimental research methods, since correlation does not imply causation. Without manipulating the independent variable and using random assignment, establishing causation is not possible. But complex correlational methods enable us to eliminate other plausible explanations for causal relationships. This is done by statistically controlling for potential variables, meaning these variables are included in the analysis. This approach helps researchers analyze the connection between two variables while accounting for possible confounding factors. Let's say you are interested in the relationship between watching violent TV shows and aggressive behaviors in children, but you are thinking that socioeconomic status, or SES, might be a third variable influencing the correlation. To investigate this possibility, you can calculate the correlation between watching violent TV shows and SES, and aggressive behavior and SES separately. When we encounter the third variable problem, the correlation disappears once the third variable is included in the analysis. This technique identifies a third variable, but researchers using this method are still limited in their ability to establish causality because it does not address the directionality problem. And there may be other third variables influencing the relationship that the researcher did not identify or statistically control. Regression. Once a relationship between two variables are established, researchers can use this information to predict the value of one variable using the other. For instance, after discovering a correlation between SAT EBRW, this is the means evidence-based reading and writing. So it's a reading writing test, and SAT math scores. It becomes possible to estimate SAT math scores from individuals' SAT reading and writing scores. Although the correlation coefficient indicates the strength and the direction of the relationship between variables, regression offers the technique to predict one variable based on another. In addition, regression can capture more complex relationships involving multiple variables. Typically, the variable used for prediction is called the predictor variable, which is on the x-axis on the graph, while the variable being predicted is referred to as the outcome or criterion variable, shown on the y-axis on the graph. The y hat in the regression formula represents the person's predicted score on the outcome variable, and A is the point at which the regression line crosses the y-axis, and B is the slope of the regression line, and X is the value for which you wish to predict Y value. So to predict a person's SAT math score on the outcome variable, Y hat, simply plug in their SAT reading writing score on the predictor variable X. So if an individual's SAT, the reading and writing score is 550, it is predicted that this person's SAT math score will be 550. So you can just simply plug in, use the formula 165 plus zero point 0.7 times 550, and you should get 550. By the way, the reason the regression line does not cross 165 on the y-axis in this graph is that the lower scores are truncated. If both axes started with the score 0 on the graph, you would see that the slope crosses 165 on the y-axis. Simple regression uses one variable to predict another, whereas multiple regression involves measuring several variables to predict an outcome. It can also be used to describe the relationship between one outcome variable and a set of predictor variables. The regression weights show how much a predictor variable contributes, on average, to predicting the outcome variable. Specifically, they represent how much the outcome variable changes for each 1 unit increase in the predictor variable. The advantage of multiple regression is that it can show whether a predictor variable contributes to an outcome variable beyond the influence of other predictor variables. In other words, it can determine whether a predictor variable is related to an outcome after statistically controlling for other predictors. For example, a researcher might want to analyze how income and health relate to happiness. This is complicated because income and health are interconnected. For instance, if higher income correlates with greater happiness, it could be because those individuals are healthier. Conversely, healthier individuals might be happier because they earn more. A multiple regression analysis, including both income and health as predictors, can determine whether each uniquely affects happiness when controlling for the other. Actual studies indicate that both income and health minimally impact happiness, except in cases of extreme poverty or illness. Next section, 31, qualitative research. We mainly discuss quantitative research because many studies conducted by psychological scientists are quantitative. Another method different from quantitative approaches is called qualitative research. This type, often used by anthropologists and sociologists, gathers descriptive data without relying on statistical techniques from a relatively small sample size to understand the overall experience of research participants. Qualitative researchers often do not create a hypothesis before collecting data, but develop it as they gather information. For example, consider a study by researcher Per Lindqvist and his team aiming to understand how families of teenage suicide victims cope with their grief. It's a very heavy topic. They did not set a specific research question or hypothesis. Instead, their goal was to explore the range of reactions among families, focusing on their perspectives. To do this, they interviewed the families of 10 teenage suicide victims in their homes in rural Sweden. In their semi-structured interviews, they asked the families to discuss the victim with an open invitation to share anything else they wish to discuss. Researchers found that, as you might be able to imagine, families continue to struggle with why their loved one took their own life, even as life gradually returned to kind of normal-ish, especially for families where the suicide was more unexpected. So, the quantitative research method is widely used by psychological scientists, but why is that? This is because the main advantage of this approach is its ability to produce precise numerical data to answer specific questions and to allow broad generalizations about human behavior. However, as can be seen in the table in the slide, a key limitation is its difficulty in generalizing new gen no, generating difficulty in generating new and interesting research questions. Additionally, quantitative methods often lack detailed insights into how particular groups behave in specific situations. Lastly, they tend to fall short in conveying the first-hand experience of being part of a certain group within a specific context. In contrast, qualitative research methods are particularly valuable when formulating new and inspiring research questions and hypotheses. They provide extensive, detailed insights into human behavior in real-world settings, often described as thick description. Additionally, qualitative approaches capture the subjective experience of being part of a particular group or situation, known as the lived experience of participants. These deep insights are usually not accessible through quantitative methods. Data collection methods for qualitative research studies include naturalistic observation, participant observation, archival data, and the most common approach, interviews. Interviews can be structured with detailed scripts for the interviewer or unstructured, where participants are asked to respond freely to a few general questions. However, most interviews are semi-structured, which falls somewhere between unstructured and structured interviews, and they can be lengthy and detailed. Another approach in qualitative research involves using small groups known as focus groups, where participants discuss a specific topic. The interaction with focus groups can sometimes produce more insights than individual interviews. This method has become common in business and industry for understanding consumer preferences. Usually, the focus group discussions are recorded and transcribed for analysis. However, researchers should remember that group dynamics can shape behavior. For instance, the desire to be liked might cause participants to give responses they believe will be viewed positively. Similarly, personality traits can affect involvement. For instance, highly extroverted individuals are more likely to dominate conversations. So far, we have discussed the differences between quantitative and qualitative research methods, but how data are analyzed is the key to differentiating these two approaches. For example, imagine data are collected through unstructured interviews with individuals recovering from alcohol use disorder to explore the role of their religious faith in their recovery. These collected data can be coded based on how many times they engaged in specific behaviors or mentioned specific words or phrases. Researchers then calculate descriptive statistics and inferential statistics to determine if there are statistically significant differences. Now, this study a hypothetical study, can be categorized more as quantitative research. This example scenario illustrates that the quantitative qualitative distinction relies more on how researchers use the data they have gathered than on the reasons or methods being behind the data collection. There are many ways to analyze qualitative data. One example is called grounded theory. This approach was developed by sociologists in the 1960s and gradually became popular in the field of psychological science. In contrast to qualitative research, where researchers start with hypotheses derived from a theory, the qualitative research with grounded theory begins with data collection before developing the hypothesis. This approach consists of several stages. First, they identify recurring ideas across the data. Next, they group these ideas into a few broader themes. And finally, they craft a theoretical narrative that in, interprets the data through these themes. This narrative emphasizes the participants' subjective experiences and is often supported by numerous direct quotations from them. For example, consider a study with the grounded theory approach by researchers Laura Abrams and Laura Curran, who explored postpartum depression symptoms among low-income mothers. They conducted unstructured interviews with 19 participants and recorded many direct quotes from the participants. Table 6.4 in the slide outlines the five broad themes identified by the researchers, along with the specific recurring ideas within each theme. For example, a participant, Destiny, stated, so this is the direct quote, well, just recently my apartment was broken into, and the fact that his Medicaid for some reason was canceled, so a lot of things was happening within the last 2 weeks all at one time. So that in itself, I don't want to say almost drove me mad, but it put me in a funk, like I really was depressed. So that's the direct quote. Their theoretical narrative emphasized the participants' experience of their symptoms as more than an abstract affective disorder. It was directly connected to the daily challenges of raising children alone in often difficult conditions. As we have seen in this chapter, compared to qualitative research methods, quantitative research methods have higher objectivity, higher reliability, higher internal validity, and higher external validity. In contrast, qualitative research methods can better capture the holistic understanding of human behavior and experience compared to quantitative research methods. However, both quantitative and qualitative researchers are well aware of the weaknesses of their research, the research approach. For example, quantitative researchers are well aware of the issue of oversimplification of human behaviors, and human behaviors and experiences cannot be adequately described in simple numbers and statistical analysis. Many researchers from both camps now agree that the two approaches can and should be combined into what has come to be called mixed methods research. In fact, the studies by Lindqvist and colleagues and by Abrams and Curran both combined qualitative and quantitative approaches. So how do researchers integrate these two methods? One approach is to use qualitative research to generate hypotheses and quantitative research to test them. For example, while qualitative study might indicate that families facing an unexpected suicide struggle more with resolving the question of why, a carefully designed quantitative study could test this hypothesis by measuring those variables across a large sample. Another method for integrating quantitative and qualitative research is known as triangulation. It involves using both types of methods at the same time to explore similar questions and then comparing the outcomes. When the results from quantitative and qualitative approaches align on the same overall conclusion, they support and enhance each other. If instead the results differ, this indicates a new interesting question. How do they diverge and how might they be brought into agreement? Using qualitative research, such as surveys or interviews, often helps clarify quantitative findings, that is, statistical analysis, through triangulation. A group of researchers in 2008 studied female engineering students at a university. Initially, these students completed a survey, the rating perceptions like their sense of belonging. The results showed no significant differences among different ethnic groups in their sense of belonging. This might suggest that ethnicity does not influence belonging. However, in the second phase, the researchers conducted interviews where many minority students shared that cultural diversity at the university increased their sense of belonging. Without the qualitative data, the survey results could have been misinterpreted. This example clearly demonstrates how qualitative and quantitative research complement each other in understanding human behavior. Some researchers view qualitative research as ideal for identifying behaviors or phenomena, while quantitative research is better suited for understanding meaning or mechanisms. All right, this is the last section, section 32, observational research. What is observational research? You might think observational research simply involves watching behaviors of a target individual and take notes on what seems important, but that's not true at all. Instead, researchers need to identify the specific behaviors of an individual or a group and systematically observe and record them. Usually, the data obtained through observational research methods are qualitative, but they can also be quantitative or both. We'll look at several types of observational research methods the in the next few slides. Naturalistic observation, a type of field research, involves target behaviors in natural environment in which they typically occur. A good example is Dr. Goodall's, I hope I said it right, the research on chimpanzees. I am pretty sure that you have seen her before. Over 3 decades, she has observed chimpanzees in their natural East African habitat, studying their social structure, mating behavior, gender roles, family dynamics, and how they care for their offspring. Naturalistic observation can take place in various settings, such as classrooms, gyms, and hospitals. However, the presence of observers might influence the behavior of individuals being studied. To minimize this effect, researchers often go undercover using a method called disguised naturalistic observation. This raises ethical questions about observing people who are unaware they are being watched. However, as long as participants remain anonymous and the observation occurs in a public place where privacy is not expected, this practice is generally considered ethical. It is generally acceptable to observe behavior in settings like a grocery store or classroom, but doing so in a place where people expect privacy, such as a bathroom, would not be ethically appropriate for obvious reasons. If you cannot conduct disguised naturalistic observation for ethical or practical reasons, undisguised naturalistic observation can be used. However, a limitation of undisguised naturalistic observation is reactivity, where the presence of a researcher and awareness of being observed can alter participants' behaviors. This type of reactivity is known as the Hawthorne effect. In the 1920s, a lighting bulb company, attempted to promote its bulbs, the light bulbs, by comparing performance under bright and dark conditions. They collaborated with a telephone firm to test if brighter lighting could enhance productivity, with the goal of demonstrating that the higher brightness leads to more work and increased sales. Surprisingly, the experiment revealed no significant difference in output between the two settings. So, what went wrong? During the test, supervisors watched the factory workers on the lines. If I were a worker and I knew I was being watched by the higher ups, I'd be working my butt off regardless of the lighting. And that's probably what the workers did. Their behavior was influenced because they knew they were being observed by their managers. This effect, where individuals change their behavior when they know they are watched, is called the Hawthorne effect. Another method in observational research is a participant observation, in which researchers become active members in the group or situation they are studying. This type of approach is very similar to naturalistic observation because it involves observing people's behavior in an environment where target behaviors naturally occur, and researchers become part of it. Data collection involves unstructured interviews, taking notes based on observations, interviews, and documentation. The only difference between naturalistic observation and a participant observation is that researchers engaged in participant observation become active members of the group or situations they are studying. The fundamental reason for participant observation is that some crucial information can only be obtained or understood by someone actively involved in the group or situation. Similar to naturalistic observation, participant observation can be conducted in a disguised or undisguised manner. A well-known example of covert participant observation was conducted by Leon Festinger and his team on the Seekers, a doomsday religious group. These members believed that aliens called the Guardians would trigger the apocalypse. I can't say this, but you know what I mean. On December 21st, 1954. Apocalypse. Undercover researchers' goal was to observe how members would respond psychologically when their prophecy failed. The picture in the slide shows them going home because aliens did not show up after singing Christmas carols for them. It's pretty sad, right? The researchers carefully documented the events and reactions of the cult members before and after predicted end of the world. Of course, the members did not change their minds a bit and convinced themselves that their faith and actions had saved the world from destruction. Festinger and his colleagues later published a book about this case, demonstrating the theory of cognitive dissonance. Disguised participant observation, like Festinger and colleagues' study, raises significant ethical concerns. It involves a deception, and informed consent is not obtained as researchers intentionally withhold information about their true motives for studying the social group. Nonetheless, in certain cases, such as investigating cults, disguised participation may be the only way to gain access. Additionally, this method tends to be less affected by reactivity compared to undisguised observation. Rosenhan's 1973 study of individuals in psychiatric ward is another example of a disguised participant observation. Rosenhan and his pseudo-patients were admitted to psychiatric hospitals under the guise of being patients, allowing them to observe staff treatment. of psychiatric patients. Both staff and other patients were unaware of their identities as researchers. One key advantage of participant observation is that researchers gain a deeper understanding of the perspectives and experiences of the people they study by immersing themselves in their social group. However, a major limitation is that the observer's presence might influence the behavior of those being observed. While this issue also exists in naturalistic observation, additional challenges arise when researchers actively become members of the social group, potentially altering social dynamics or affecting participants' behavior. Furthermore, acting as a participant observer can introduce biases, since forming relationships with participants might make the researcher less objective and increase experimenter bias. Structured observation is an alternative observational method where the researcher closely observes specific behaviors in a controlled environment. Unlike naturalistic or participant observation, this setting is usually artificial, often conducted in the lab. However, it can also happen in natural settings, such as a classroom where the researcher deliberately structures the environment, possibly by assigning a particular task or creating a specific social situation or manipulation. Structured observation is similar to naturalistic and participant observation because all three methods involve observing behaviors that occur naturally. However, its main goal is to gather quantitative data rather than qualitative data. Researchers focus on a select few behaviors, allowing precise measurement and quantification. Unlike broader naturalistic or participant observation, which may include more behaviors, structured observation concentrates on specific ones. Consequently, observers do not record everything, but instead focus only on the behaviors of interest. Researchers Robert Revine and Ara Norenzayan utilized structured observation to examine variations in the pace of life among different countries. Observations were conducted in natural environment. They measured how long pedestrians took to walk 60 feet in a busy city. Results indicated that some nations consistently had faster moving pedestrians than others. For instance, in Canada and Sweden, people averaged just under 13 seconds to walk 60 feet, whereas in Brazil and Romania, it was nearly 17 seconds. There's a huge difference. When conducting structured observations in the real world setting, that can be complex and chaotic, it's important to account for timing, location, conditions, and individuals observed. Clearly defining the sampling process simplifies data collection for observers and help manage important extraneous variables. For example, Levine and Norenzayan observed people on sunny summer days in various countries to consider weather influences on walking speed. Their method was straightforward. They marked a 60-foot section of a city sidewalk and used stopwatch to record the time participants took to walk it. In a laboratory setting, Dov Cohen and colleagues asked observers to evaluate participants' emotional reactions after they were deliberately bumped and insulted by a Confederate. This happened after participants dropped off a questionnaire at the end of a hallway. The Confederate, pretending to work nearby, appeared frustrated because they had to close a file drawer twice. Once when the participant dropped off the questionnaire, and again when returning to the main study room. Two observers positioned at opposite ends of the hallway watched the participants' body language and overheard responses. The study found that Southern U.S. participants, known for their culture of honor, demonstrated more aggression than northern US participants. When observations depend on the observer's judgment, coding is often necessary. This involves clearly defining target behaviors, with observers categorizing each participant based on the behaviors displayed and their frequency. They may also record how long each behavior lasts. To maintain consistency, these behavior definitions must be precise so that different observers code them in a similar way. This highlights the importance of inter-rater reliability discussed in the previous chapter. Researchers demonstrate this reliability by having multiple raters independently code the same behaviors and compare results. One major advantage of structured observation is its higher efficiency compared to naturalistic and participant observation. Since researchers focus on specific behaviors, this method saves time and reduces cost. Often the environment is arranged to encourage the behaviors of interest, which means researchers spend less time waiting for these behaviors to occur naturally. Additionally, this method gives researchers more control over the environment. However, increased control can make the settings less natural, which might reduce external validity. For example, it's uncertain whether observations made in a laboratory setting will apply to real-world environments. Moreover, since researchers are often not hidden, concerns about reactivity may be greater. Case studies. A case study examines individuals, social units such as a cult, or events in depth, often focusing on rare conditions or brain damage. Mostly qualitative, they involve detailed, sometimes longitudinal analysis. Participants may be observed naturally or in labs, with reports emphasizing descriptions over statistical analysis, but some data, such as depression scores or IQ test results, may be included. Methods such as interviews, observation, psychological tests, and brain scans are commonly employed in case studies. Let's take a look at one of the famous case studies in the history of psychology. This study was done by Sigmund Freud on Anna O. Anna was under the care of Joseph Breuer, a physician who discovered the function of the semicircular canals of the inner ear for balance. Anna showed a wide range of hysterical and other symptoms, such as a persistent nervous cough. Her right side appeared to be paralyzed, visual and auditory deficits, and weird eating habits, such as only eating oranges for weeks. A traditional description of the core idea of Brewer's treatment for Anna was that symptoms could be eliminated by talking through memories associated with them. Brewer called this method catharsis. According to him, when he was able to trace back to the first memory that is associated with a particular symptom, Anna O would experience an emotional release and the symptom would disappear. But what actually happened was not that straightforward. According to Ellenberger in 1972, catharsis showed some success, but the cure was temporary. In addition, she had additional symptoms other than hysteria, such as psychotic symptoms and those of a possible dissociative disorder. According to Ellenberger, instead of being cured, Anna O spent a year in an asylum after Brewer ended treatment with her. Fortunately, she eventually recovered and became an advocate for women's rights in Germany. 50 years after her death, a stamp honoring her work was issued in 1954. Breuer, I hope I said his last name right, Breuer, told Freud about the case of Anna O, and eventually this case became one of the several discussed in their book published in 1895. This book is considered the foundation of psychoanalysis. For Freud, the memory of traumatic events becomes repressed into the unconscious mind, and it continues to influence mental health as hysteric symptoms. Hysteric symptoms are symbolically connected to the cause, and these symptoms can be treated when the lost memory is recovered, according to them. Freud also believed that Anna O projected emotions and images from past relationships onto Brewer, thereby becoming emotionally attached to him. Freud called this transference. Here's another example of a case study. This involves patient HM, who is probably the most frequently mentioned individual in cognitive psychology and neuroscience literature. He is arguably the most famous research participant in the history of the entire field of science. After suffering a brain injury as a child, he developed symptoms of epilepsy. His doctors decided that the best treatment was to remove the medial temporal lobe and most of both hippocampi, which are essential brain regions for memory formation. After recovering from the surgery, his epileptic episodes significantly decreased and his IQ scores improved actually, but he became anterograde amnesic. In other words, he was unable to form new memories. HM could still learn tasks involving perception and motor functions, and he could retain these memories for a long time. However, he had no knowledge of how to perform these tasks or of meeting any of the researchers or nurses. One of the tasks he was asked to do was mirror tracing. Now, I want you guys to try this yourself to see if you can do it. So you need a mirror, a pen, and a paper. The goal of this task is to successfully trace a star shape printed on a paper using only the mirror image of the original image of the star. You cannot look directly at the paper, and of course, you need to be as accurate as possible. HM was instructed to practice this task at the physician's office 10 times a day. Every day, every time he visited the office without any knowledge of the physician, the research, or the tasks. He acted as if he had never done this before every single time he visited the office, yet remarkably, his skills consistently improved with more practice. This shows that his procedural memory, a type of implicit memory, and working memory were intact, but his episodic memory was impaired. His case supports the idea that implicit memory and explicit memory are independent of each other. He passed away in 2008 at the age of 82. This is the end of chapter 6.